Hi class, welcome to video number 4. In this video, we are talking about classical conditioning. We'll talk about how it started, the terms in it, we'll talk about your assignment that's due at the end of the week. This week, you should be reading modules 27 through 31, and contained in that, we're talking about learning and behaviors and classical conditioning and operant conditioning and the differences between the two and ways that we learn and observe learning and ways that we can quit bad habits and how we can apply that to our lives and the world around us. So it's pretty interesting stuff. So I hope you're keeping up with your reading. Classical conditioning starts on page 244 in your textbook. So classical conditioning was founded by a guy named Ivan Pavlov. He was from Russia and he was studying digestion. He accidentally discovered classical conditioning while he was studying digestion. It's crazy. It's such a huge factor in psychology, and it's this monumental thing that we've discovered and learned from and used, and it was an accident. He was studying digestion, and so he was using dogs, and he had a tube placed in their mouth, and it would measure how much they would salivate. And he noticed at a certain point in his study that when he walked in the room, the dogs would start salivating. And he was like, wait a second, they shouldn't be salivating to me. They've learned something. Something's been conditioned. So that's why we call this conditioning, and we just call it classical conditioning because the error in history in which it was founded. So classical conditioning, an accident that kind of changed the world. So Ivan Pavlov totally ditched his digestion study. He was like, well, forget that. This is a big deal. I need to figure out what's going on here. So what he did was he took his dogs, he left their little salivation tubes in there, and he would take a bell. He would ring the bell. Then he would put meat powder, which sounds gross, but works for dogs. He'd put meat powder on their tongues. They would start salivating, and he would take the measurements, how much they would salivate. And he would do that over and over. He'd ring the bell, he'd feed them. He'd ring the bell, he'd feed them. Because initially, ringing the bell did not make the dog salivate. They have no need to salivate to a bell. You can't eat that. It's not a biological response. But after being paired, the bell and the meat powder, for a while, he could just ring the bell and they would start salivating. So they were conditioned to respond to the bell when that wasn't a natural response. That's not a natural stimulus. So we have a bunch of terms that we used. So we have the unconditioned stimulus, the conditioned stimulus, the unconditioned response, and the conditioned response, and we have the neutral stimulus. So for this example, the meat powder was the unconditioned stimulus. The meat powder is what the dog salivated to with or without anything else. It was unconditioned. They didn't do anything for the dogs to salivate to the meat powder. The unconditioned response is salivating. The dogs would salivate to the meat powder without anyone having to do anything. So those two things were unconditioned. Those two things occur naturally. The neutral stimulus was the bell. So at the beginning of the experiment, it was neutral. It didn't matter. It didn't do anything. It was just a bell. But the bell became the conditioned stimulus by many times of pairing it with the unconditioned stimulus, the meat powder. The bell moved from a neutral stimulus to the conditioned stimulus. And then the conditioned response was salivating to the conditioned stimulus. So those two things didn't occur naturally, but they were achieved through the experiment, through classical conditioning. So we call the phase when the bell is being connected to salivating, we call that stage acquisition phase. Think about acquiring something, or getting something, or gaining something. So that's the acquisition stage during classical conditioning. So you might wonder, if we can acquire connections in classical conditioning, could we ever lose them? Is that something that we could get rid of as well? Well, the answer to that is yes. So think about if Ivan Pavlov had his dogs there and he kept ringing the bell, giving them the meat powder. They would salivate, and then after a while he could just ring the bell and they would salivate. But how long do you think after ringing the bell and no meat powder they would continue to salivate? Maybe a day, maybe the next day, maybe a week. It's hard to tell. Different dogs, different strengths. Maybe they've been conditioned for a long time, maybe they've only been conditioned for a week. It's different for each situation, each person, but eventually it would be broken. Because if you rang the bell for a month and you never gave the dog meat powder, eventually the dog would no longer salivate to the bell. Because remember, that was conditioned. That was a conditioned stimulus. It wasn't natural. But they'll always salivate to the meat powder, whether there's a bell or not, because that was unconditioned. That was something that occurs naturally. So When this goes away, when this connection, this conditioned response goes away, we call that extinction, which makes sense. It's extinct. Sometimes, though, things can happen and they can come back. We call that spontaneous recovery. So the dogs didn't get the meat powder with the bell anymore, and it's been extinct. But all of a sudden, one day, they do get it. They get the meat powder with the bell, and then the next day the bell rings and, oh, it's back. It just spontaneously came back. Or say they still didn't get it for a week, but you rang a bell and all of a sudden one day they started salivating just a little bit, but then they stopped because they still didn't get any food. So it could spontaneously recover, but it probably wouldn't be for longer than a time or two before it was extinct again. Something that's connected to this are phobias, learned fears. We call that conditioned emotional responses. Almost all phobias are conditioned or learned through a form of classical conditioning, emotional classical conditioning. Because think about, well, for example, me. So I was not afraid of snakes at all. Didn't mind them. I didn't love them, but I didn't hate them. They were a neutral stimulus for me. And then in high school, there was a very large snake that got in our yard. I live in the middle of the city. I'm not used to snakes or things like that, not at the zoo or on television. And the snake was well over 5 feet long. And my dad was at work, and there was no one there that could take care of it. And I was there with it, and it was really frightening. And so from that moment on, for years, pictures of snakes or videos of snakes or snakes in cages at the zoo, I would start crying and I would go away from it, and it seemed really irrational because the snakes on my cell phone is a picture on Google. Obviously, it's not going to hurt me, but it was a phobia that had occurred because of a moment where I experienced something that I didn't have control over, and it scared me. So ways that we can help phobias and emotional conditioned responses is through something called systematic desensitization. So systematic desensitization slowly introduces what you're scared of back into your life. So counselors or psychologists or therapy sessions could do this. You could do this yourself if you really wanted to, which is what I did with the snakes. So I wouldn't go into the reptile house at the zoo at all at first, but then after a while I would go in it, but I would just look at the ground. And I would go in it and I would just look at the lizards or the spiders or things that I wasn't scared of in the reptile house. But then I would go in it and I would look at some of the snakes. And then after a while, I could look at them from the other side of the room. So if I were here, I could look at the snakes over in the glass boxes on the other side of the room. And so now I can see pictures of them on my cell phone, or I can see videos on Animal Planet. I just can't necessarily see them in real life. If I see a snake in real life, someone holding it, I definitely stay on the other side of the street. But I don't start crying and I don't run away. And so I feel like we're making progress with my emotionally conditioned response. Your assignment for this week is to think about 2 examples in your life where you've learned something based on classical conditioning. So it doesn't need to be more than a paragraph long for each thing that you've learned. But I want you to title everything. So I want you to say, I learned this example because of classical conditioning, or this happened to me through classical conditioning. But I want you to label the conditioned response, the conditioned stimulus, the unconditioned response, the unconditioned stimulus, and what the neutral stimulus was. I just want you to be really familiar with these terms and just get to know them, because you might think, are all these labels important? Like, these are a lot of letters and abbreviations, but it makes it easier to apply it to other situations and to apply it to other examples when we can just say CS, US, things like that. So I know it seems like a lot, but the more familiar you get with them, the easier that it'll be for you to use them interchangeably in different situations. So have fun with that, and do some introspecting and see when you have seen classical conditioning in your own life. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to email me or message me, and I will see you next week. Bye.